The alarm clock showed 6:30 a.m., but Chief David Williams was already wide awake. After 25 years in law enforcement, his body had learned to wake up early, even on weekends. But this Saturday was different. This Saturday was his. He rolled over carefully, trying not to wake his wife Michelle, who was still sleeping peacefully beside him. The morning light filtered through their bedroom curtains, casting a warm glow across the room they had worked so hard to afford. Their house in Pine Valley Estates wasn't the biggest in the neighborhood, but it was theirs. And David felt proud every time he pulled into the driveway. Slipping into his robe, David made his way downstairs to the kitchen. The house was quiet, a rare treat in their usually busy household. Their 16-year-old son Jake was sleeping over at his best friend's house, and their 14-year-old daughter Lisa was at a weekend camp with her soccer team. For the first time in months, David and Michelle had the house completely to themselves. He started the coffee maker, listening to the familiar gurgling sound as it came to life. Through the kitchen window, he could see his backyard and, more importantly, the pool that had been his dream for over 3 years. The crystal clear water sparkled in the morning sunlight, looking absolutely perfect. David had saved every extra dollar for that pool. While his colleagues went out for expensive dinners or bought new cars, he and Michelle had lived modestly, putting money aside month after month. Being a police chief in a mid-sized town paid well enough, but it wasn't luxury money. Every dollar had to be earned and saved carefully. The pool installation had taken 2 months to complete. David remembered how excited he was the day the workers finally finished. He had called in sick to work just to be there when they filled it with water for the first time. Michelle had laughed at him, calling him a big kid, but he didn't care. This pool represented something bigger than just a place to swim. It represented success, stability, and the American dream he had worked so hard to achieve. Growing up in a small apartment across town, David had never imagined he would one day own a house with a pool. His mother had worked 2 jobs just to keep food on the table, and summers meant playing in the fire hydrant spray, not lounging by a pool. The journey from that small apartment to this beautiful home in Pine Valley Estates had been long and sometimes difficult, but every challenge had been worth it. As the coffee finished brewing, David poured himself a large mug and added just a touch of cream. He had developed this Saturday morning ritual over the past few weeks since the pool was completed. Wake up early, make coffee, and enjoy a peaceful swim before the rest of the world woke up. It was his meditation, his way of processing the stress of a demanding job. Being police chief wasn't easy. Every day brought new challenges, difficult decisions, and the weight of responsibility for the entire community. David took his job seriously, perhaps too seriously according to Michelle. She often reminded him that he needed to find ways to relax and unwind. The pool had become his answer to that advice. He opened the sliding glass door that led to the backyard patio. The morning air was perfect, warm but not hot, with just a gentle breeze. The pool area looked like something from a magazine. Michelle had insisted on professional landscaping around the pool, and the investment had paid off beautifully. Colorful flowers bloomed in carefully planned beds, and the new deck furniture looked inviting and expensive. David set his coffee mug on the small table next to his favorite lounge chair and looked around his backyard with satisfaction. The neighbors were all still asleep, their houses quiet and peaceful. Pine Valley Estates was known for being a quiet, family-friendly neighborhood where people respected each other's privacy and maintained their properties well. When David and Michelle had first looked at houses in this area, they had worried about fitting in. It wasn't that they couldn't afford it, but David knew that as one of the few black families in the neighborhood, they might face some challenges. Michelle had been more optimistic, insisting that people would judge them by their character, not their appearance. So far, she had been mostly right. Their immediate neighbors, the Johnsons, had welcomed them with homemade cookies and genuine warmth. David tested the pool water temperature with his toe. Perfect. He had learned to maintain the pool himself, studying online videos and reading manuals until he became something of an expert. There was something satisfying about taking care of it personally, rather than hiring a service. It made the pool feel even more his own. He removed his robe and dove cleanly into the deep end. The water enveloped him like a cool embrace, washing away the stress and tension he carried in his shoulders. This was what peace felt like. This was what he had worked so hard to achieve. As he swam laps, David's mind wandered to the week ahead. There was a budget meeting with the city council on Tuesday, a community safety presentation on Thursday, and the monthly department meeting on Friday. But for now, none of that mattered. For now, there was just the rhythm of his strokes through the water and the gentle morning sunshine on his back. After about 15 minutes of swimming laps, David floated on his back, looking up at the clear blue sky. A few clouds drifted lazily overhead, and he could hear birds singing in the oak trees that bordered his property. This was exactly the kind of moment Michelle always told him to appreciate more often. He thought about how proud his mother would be if she could see him now. She had passed away 5 years ago, but not before seeing her son become police chief and buy his first house. She had always told him that hard work and determination could overcome any obstacle, and she had been right. This pool, this house, this life was proof of that. David climbed out of the pool and reached for his towel, feeling completely relaxed for the first time in weeks. He picked up his coffee mug and settled into his lounge chair, planning to spend at least another hour enjoying the peaceful morning before Michelle woke up and their day officially began. The neighborhood was still quiet, and David felt grateful for this perfect moment of solitude in his own backyard. Little did he know that his peaceful morning was about to be interrupted in a way that would change everything and remind him that even success and achievement couldn't always protect him from the assumptions others made about him. David was just settling back into his lounge chair when he heard the distinctive click of high heels on his wooden deck. He looked up, surprised to see a woman standing at the edge of his pool area, her hands planted firmly on her hips. She was blonde, probably in her early 40s, wearing expensive-looking workout clothes and designer sunglasses despite the early hour. He recognized her immediately as Patricia Wells. Though they had never been formally introduced, she lived 3 houses down from him, in the largest house on the street. David had seen her around the neighborhood, usually getting in and out of her white luxury SUV or working in her perfectly manicured garden. Michelle had mentioned wanting to introduce themselves, but their schedules never seemed to align. "Excuse me," Patricia said, her voice sharp and demanding. "You need to leave this property immediately." David almost choked on his coffee. He set the mug down carefully and stood up, confused by the confrontation. "I'm sorry, what?" "You heard me," Patricia continued, her tone becoming more aggressive. "This is private property and you're trespassing. I don't know how you got back here, but you need to go. Now." David felt a familiar knot forming in his stomach. He had hoped that moving to Pine Valley Estates would mean leaving these kinds of encounters behind, but apparently he had been too optimistic. He took a deep breath, reminding himself to stay calm and professional. "Ma'am, I think there's been a misunderstanding," David said, keeping his voice steady and polite. "This is my home. My wife and I live here." Patricia laughed, but there was no humor in it. "Right, try again. I know the people who live here, and you're definitely not one of them." The irony of the situation wasn't lost on David. Here he was, a police chief with over 2 decades of experience, being accused of trespassing in his own backyard. He had dealt with countless situations like this from the other side, but being on the receiving end felt completely different. "I'm David Williams," he said, extending his hand in what he hoped was a gesture of goodwill. "My wife Michelle and I moved in about 8 months ago. We have 2 kids, Jake and Lisa." Patricia ignored his outstretched hand completely. "I don't care what story you've made up. I've lived in this neighborhood for 12 years and I know everyone who belongs here." "You don't belong here." David let his hand drop to his side. The phrase "you don't belong here" hit him harder than he expected. He had heard variations of it throughout his life, but somehow it stung more coming from someone who was supposed to be his neighbor. "Look," David tried again, "I understand this might seem unusual, but I really do live here. If you'd like, I can show you my identification, or we could call my wife. She's inside sleeping right now." "Oh, so now there are more of you?" Patricia's voice rose an octave. "How many people are squatting in that house?" David felt his patience beginning to wear thin. 25 years of police work had taught him to deal with difficult people, but this was testing even his considerable self-control. The fact that this was happening in his own backyard, during what should have been a peaceful morning, made it even more frustrating. "Ma'am, nobody is squatting anywhere," David said, his professional training kicking in. "This is my home. I pay the mortgage, I pay the property taxes, and I maintain the pool you're standing next to. I'm not sure what led you to believe otherwise, but I assure you, you're mistaken." Patricia pulled out her phone and began scrolling through it aggressively. We'll see about that. I have the contact information for everyone in this neighborhood. I run the neighborhood watch program, so I know exactly who lives where. David almost laughed at the irony. As police chief, he had worked with several neighborhood watch programs, always encouraging community involvement in safety efforts. The idea that someone from such a program was now treating him like a criminal in his own yard was almost too absurd to believe. That's great that you're involved in neighborhood watch, David said, still trying to maintain a diplomatic tone. Community involvement is really important for safety. But in this case, you might want to double-check your information. Don't patronize me, Patricia snapped. I know what I know. The people who live in this house are a nice young couple with children. They're professionals, respectable people. Not people like you. There it was. The phrase David had been waiting for. The one that made everything crystal clear. People like you. He had heard it countless times throughout his career, usually directed at suspects or troublemakers. Hearing it applied to himself while standing in his own backyard felt like a punch to the gut. What exactly do you mean by people like me? David asked, though he already knew the answer. Patricia seemed to realize she had said something she shouldn't have. She backtracked quickly, but the damage was already done. I mean people who don't belong in this neighborhood. People who break into houses and use other people's pools. We have rules here, standards. David looked around his backyard, thinking about all the work he and Michelle had put into making it their own. The pool they had saved for. The landscaping they had carefully planned. The deck furniture they had chosen together. This wasn't just his house. It was his home, his sanctuary, the place where he should feel safest and most relaxed. I understand you're concerned about neighborhood security, David said, making one last attempt at reasonableness. That's actually something I care about too, given my profession. But I need you to understand that you're accusing the wrong person. I live here. This is my pool, my deck, my coffee getting cold on that table. Patricia looked at the coffee mug as if seeing it for the first time, and for a moment, David thought he saw a flicker of doubt cross her face, but it passed quickly, replaced by renewed determination. Anyone can claim anything, she said. For all I know, you broke in and made yourself comfortable. Maybe you even made that coffee in their kitchen. I've heard about people like that, criminals who break into houses and act like they own the place. David realized that no amount of explanation was going to change Patricia's mind. She had decided who he was and what he was doing, and facts weren't going to sway her. It was a frustrating but familiar feeling, one that reminded him why his job as police chief was so important. If people in positions of authority didn't stand up against these kinds of assumptions, nothing would ever change, ma'am, David said, his voice taking on a slightly firmer tone. I'm going to ask you one more time to reconsider what's happening here. I'm standing in my own backyard next to the pool I saved for 3 years to build, trying to enjoy a peaceful Saturday morning. I've been polite and patient, but your accusations are both wrong and hurtful. Patricia's response would determine what happened next, and David had a sinking feeling that this conversation was about to take an even worse turn. Patricia's face hardened at David's firmer tone. Instead of reconsidering her position, she seemed to take his assertiveness as confirmation of her suspicions. She took a step back and pulled her phone out again, this time with clear intent. Don't you dare threaten me, she said, her voice getting louder. I knew this would happen eventually. People like you moving into our neighborhood thinking you can just take whatever you want. David felt his heart rate increase, but not from anger, from experience. He had seen situations like this escalate quickly, and he knew that once someone decided you were a threat, rational conversation became nearly impossible. The fact that this was happening to him, in his own backyard, while he was wearing nothing but swim shorts, made the whole situation feel surreal. Ma'am, nobody is threatening anyone, David said, raising his hand slightly to show he meant no harm. I'm simply trying to explain that this is my home. Stop lying, Patricia shouted. I'm calling the police right now. We have security cameras in this neighborhood and they'll prove you broke in here. The mention of security cameras actually gave David a moment of hope. If there were cameras, they would show him entering and leaving his own house freely, would show him working in his yard, would prove that he belonged here. But he also knew that getting to that point would require involving his own department, turning his peaceful Saturday into a professional nightmare. If you want to call the police, that's your right, David said carefully. but I think you'll find that they'll confirm what I'm telling you." Patricia was already dialing. "We'll see about that. Hello? Yes, I need police at 47 Oak Ridge Drive in Pine Valley Estates. I have a black male who has broken into my neighbor's house and is using their pool." David winced at the way she described him. Not as a person, not as a potential resident, but simply as a black male who must be a criminal. He had heard countless dispatch calls phrased exactly like that during his career. But hearing it applied to himself was jarring. He's about 6 feet tall, appears to be in his 40s, no shirt, and he's being aggressive when I told him to leave. Patricia continued into the phone. "I haven't been aggressive," David said, though he knew she couldn't hear him over her own voice. "Yes, I'll stay on the line," Patricia said, "but please hurry. I'm afraid of what he might do if he gets desperate." David couldn't believe what he was hearing. In the span of 10 minutes, he had gone from being a homeowner enjoying his morning swim to being described as a dangerous criminal. The transformation was so complete and so sudden that it felt like he was living in someone else's nightmare. "Ma'am?" David tried one more time. "Before the police arrive, would you be willing to let me show you my identification? It's right here on the table with my coffee. It will prove that I live here." Patricia looked at the table where David's wallet lay next to his cooling coffee mug. For a moment he thought she might actually consider his offer, but then her expression changed again, becoming even more suspicious. "That could be fake," she said. "Anyone can buy fake IDs online these days. Besides, you could have stolen that wallet from the real homeowner." David felt a wave of exhaustion wash over him. There was literally nothing he could say or do that would convince this woman that he belonged in his own backyard. She had created a complete narrative in her mind, and every piece of evidence that contradicted it was simply dismissed as part of some elaborate criminal scheme. "The police will be here in 5 minutes, Patricia announced, still holding her phone. "I suggest you leave now before this gets worse for you." David looked around his backyard one more time. The pool he had dreamed about, the deck he had helped design, the flowers Michelle had planted with such care. This was supposed to be his sanctuary, his reward for years of hard work and dedication. Instead, it had become the scene of one of the most humiliating experiences of his life. "I'm not leaving," David said quietly. "This is my home." Patricia's eyes widened as if he had just confirmed her worst fears. "Are you insane? The police are coming and you're refusing to leave. That just proves you're up to something criminal." David sat back down in his lounge chair, a decision that seemed to shock Patricia even more. "I'm not leaving because this is where I belong. When the police arrive, they'll confirm that." "You're just going to sit there?" Patricia asked, incredulous. "Like you own the place?" "I do own the place," David said simply. Patricia began pacing back and forth at the edge of his pool deck, muttering to herself. "This is unbelievable. The nerve of some people, breaking into a house and then refusing to leave when caught. What's this world coming to?" David watched her pace and felt a mixture of anger and sadness. Anger at being treated like a criminal in his own home, and sadness that his family's presence in this neighborhood was apparently so unthinkable to at least one of his neighbors that she couldn't accept the simple truth of the situation. He thought about Michelle, still sleeping peacefully upstairs, unaware that her husband was being treated like a dangerous intruder in their own backyard. He thought about Jake and Lisa and what they would think if they knew about this incident. Would it make them feel less safe in their own home? Would it make them question whether they really belonged in Pine Valley Estates? The sound of sirens in the distance broke through his thoughts. Patricia perked up immediately, clearly vindicated by the approaching police cars. "Finally," she said, "now you'll see what happens to people who think they can just take whatever they want." David remained seated, trying to prepare himself for what was about to happen. He knew the officers who would respond to this call. He had hired some of them, trained others, worked alongside all of them. The idea of them finding him in this situation was embarrassing beyond words. But there was something else bothering him, something that went beyond personal embarrassment. This incident was about to become a perfect example of exactly the kind of racial profiling and assumption-making that he had spent his career trying to combat. The irony that it was happening to him, the police chief in his own backyard, was almost too much to bear. The sirens grew louder, and David could see Patricia straightening her clothes and fixing her hair, preparing to tell her version of events to the arriving officers. She seemed completely confident that she was about to be vindicated, that the police would arrest the dangerous criminal who had invaded her peaceful neighborhood. David took a deep breath and prepared to face his own officers as a suspect rather than their boss. It was going to be one of the longest mornings of his life. The sirens were getting closer, and David could see the flashing lights reflecting off the windows of the houses across the street. Patricia stood at the edge of his pool deck like a sentinel, clearly feeling victorious that backup was arriving. She kept glancing at David with a mixture of satisfaction and nervousness, as if she couldn't quite believe he was still sitting calmly in the lounge chair. "They'll be here any second," Patricia said, more to herself than to David. "Finally, someone will do something about this situation." David remained quiet, his mind racing through how this encounter would play out. He knew the protocols his officers would follow. They would separate him and Patricia, get both sides of the story, and then investigate the claims. The problem was that Patricia seemed so convinced of her version of events that David wasn't sure even official identification would change her mind. 2 police cars pulled into his driveway, their lights still flashing but sirens now silent. David could see neighbors starting to peek out of their windows and step onto their porches. The quiet Saturday morning in Pine Valley Estates had just become the most exciting thing to happen in the neighborhood in months. "Here they come," Patricia announced unnecessarily. "Now you'll have to face the consequences of your actions." David watched as 4 officers emerged from the 2 vehicles. He recognized all of them immediately. Officer Rodriguez had just been promoted to sergeant last month. Officer Chen was one of their newest recruits, someone David had personally interviewed during the hiring process. Officer Thompson was a 15-year veteran who David had worked with on dozens of cases. And Officer Bailey was someone David had mentored when she was struggling with a difficult case involving domestic violence. This was going to be awkward beyond belief. The officers approached the backyard cautiously, hands near their weapons but not drawn. David appreciated their professional approach, even though the situation felt absurd from his perspective. "Ma'am," Officer Rodriguez called out to Patricia, "are you the person who called this in?" "Yes, I am," Patricia responded immediately, pointing dramatically at David. "That man broke into my neighbor's house and has been using their pool. When I confronted him about it, he became aggressive and refused to leave." David almost laughed at the description of him being aggressive. He was sitting calmly in a lounge chair wearing swim shorts with a cup of coffee. If this was what aggressive looked like, criminals had really lowered their standards. Officer Rodriguez looked at David, and David could see the exact moment recognition dawned in his eyes. The officer's professional expression faltered for just a second before he regained his composure. "Sir," Officer Rodriguez said carefully, "could you please stand up and identify yourself?" David stood slowly, keeping his movements deliberate and non-threatening. "Certainly, Officer Rodriguez. I'm Chief David Williams." The effect of those words on the group was immediate and dramatic. Officer Chen's mouth actually fell open. Officer Thompson looked like he wanted to disappear into the ground. Officer Bailey closed her eyes as if hoping this was all a bad dream. Patricia, however, wasn't ready to give up her narrative. "Oh, please," she said with a dismissive wave. "Anyone can claim to be anyone. I suppose next you'll tell me you're the mayor." Officer Rodriguez looked like he was facing the most difficult moment of his career. "Ma'am, I can confirm that this is indeed Chief Williams. I work for him directly." Patricia's confidence wavered for the first time since the confrontation began. She looked from Officer Rodriguez to David and back again, as if trying to process information that didn't fit her expectations. "That's impossible," she said finally. "The police chief doesn't live in this neighborhood. And even if he did, he certainly wouldn't look like that." Officer Thompson stepped forward, clearly trying to help his colleague navigate this minefield. "Ma'am, Chief Williams has been our police chief for over 2 years. He moved to this neighborhood about 8 months ago with his family." David watched Patricia's face as the reality of the situation began to sink in. The confident, righteous anger was slowly being replaced by confusion and the first hints of embarrassment. But he was swimming in their pool," Patricia said weakly. "The homeowners aren't supposed to be home this weekend." "Ma'am," Officer Chen said gently, "the homeowner is home. You're looking at him." Patricia turned to stare at David as if seeing him for the first time. The expensive workout clothes, the perfectly styled hair, the designer sunglasses, all of it seemed to deflate as the truth hit her. "You live here?" She asked David directly, her voice much smaller than it had been earlier. "Yes, ma'am," David replied. "My wife Michelle and I bought this house 8 months ago." We have 2 children, Jake and Lisa. I was enjoying a quiet morning swim in the pool I saved 3 years to build when you arrived and accused me of trespassing. Patricia looked around the backyard as if seeing it with new eyes. The coffee mug on the table, the personal touches in the landscaping, the way David was completely comfortable in the space. It all suddenly made sense. I don't understand, Patricia stammered. I was told. What were you told? Officer Bailey asked. Patricia seemed to realize that anything she said next would only make things worse. I didn't know. I thought I was protecting the neighborhood. David felt a wave of exhaustion wash over him. This woman had spent 30 minutes treating him like a criminal, calling him a liar, threatening him with arrest, and describing him as dangerous to the police dispatcher. And now her defense was that she didn't know. Ma'am, Officer Rodriguez said, false reporting is a serious matter. You called in a crime that didn't happen and made false statements about Chief Williams. Patricia's face went white. False reporting? But I really believed. What you believe doesn't matter, Officer Thompson said firmly. What matters is what actually happened. You accused an innocent man of multiple crimes based on nothing but assumptions. David could see the officers struggling with how to handle this situation. On one hand, Patricia had clearly made false accusations and wasted police resources. On the other hand, she was a resident of an upscale neighborhood, and arresting her would create its own set of complications. Officers, David said quietly, could I speak with you privately for a moment? The 4 officers exchanged glances and then moved toward the house, leaving Patricia standing alone by the pool. David joined them near his patio door, far enough away that Patricia couldn't hear their conversation. Chief, Officer Rodriguez said immediately, I am so sorry about this. We had no idea. It's not your fault, David interrupted. You responded to a call and followed protocol. That's exactly what you should have done. What do you want us to do? Officer Bailey asked. Technically, she did file a false report. David looked back at Patricia, who was standing by his pool looking lost and confused. Part of him wanted to see her face consequences for what she had put him through, but another part of him, the part that had spent 25 years trying to build bridges between the police and the community, knew that arresting her would only make things worse. Let me talk to her, David said. Maybe this can be a learning experience instead of a legal matter. The officers nodded, though David could see they weren't entirely happy with his decision. They returned to Patricia, who looked like she was preparing for the worst. Ma'am, Officer Rodriguez announced, Chief Williams has decided not to press charges for filing a false report. Patricia's relief was visible, but David wasn't finished yet. The real conversation was just beginning. Patricia's relief at not being arrested was short-lived as she realized that Chief Williams wanted to speak with her directly. The 4 officers stepped back but remained close enough to observe, creating a semicircle around the pool area that felt both protective and intimidating. David walked over to his patio table and picked up his wallet, removing his driver's license and police identification. He handed them to Patricia, who took them with shaking hands. Patricia Wells, David read from her expression as she examined his ID. That's your name, right? You live at 52 Oak Ridge Drive? Patricia nodded, still staring at the identification cards that proved beyond any doubt that David was exactly who he claimed to be. I want you to understand something, David continued, his voice calm but firm. What happened here this morning wasn't just a simple misunderstanding. You made assumptions about me based solely on how I look, and those assumptions led you to call the police and accuse me of multiple crimes. Patricia tried to hand the identification back, but David gestured for her to keep looking at it. I've been a police officer for 25 years, David said. I've been the chief of this department for over 2 years. I've dedicated my entire adult life to protecting and serving this community, which includes this neighborhood and you personally. Patricia finally looked up from the identification cards, tears starting to form in her eyes. I didn't know, she whispered. That's exactly the problem, David replied. You didn't know, but you were absolutely certain. You were so certain that you were willing to have me arrested. You told the dispatcher I was aggressive and dangerous. You suggested I might become violent if I got desperate. Officer Rodriguez shifted uncomfortably, remembering the dispatch call that had brought them here with elevated urgency. Ma'am, Officer Bailey interjected, do you understand how serious those accusations were? We came here prepared for a potentially dangerous situation because of your description. Patricia nodded miserably. I really thought I was doing the right thing. By assuming I was a criminal? David asked. By deciding that I couldn't possibly belong in this neighborhood? By refusing to believe me when I told you I lived here? The questions hung in the air, and Patricia seemed to shrink with each one. Around them, more neighbors had gathered on their porches and driveways, drawn by the unusual police presence. David could see them whispering among themselves, probably wondering what kind of drama was unfolding in their quiet neighborhood. I want you to think about something, David continued. If one of your white neighbors had been swimming in this pool this morning, would you have assumed they were trespassing? Patricia opened her mouth to answer, then closed it again. The answer was obvious to everyone present. If your neighbor Jim from across the street had been back here with his coffee, would you have called the police? No, Patricia admitted quietly. Why not? Patricia struggled with the question, clearly uncomfortable with the direction the conversation was taking. Because I would have assumed he had permission to be here. But you couldn't make that same assumption about me? Patricia shook her head, tears now flowing freely. I'm sorry. I'm so sorry. David sighed, feeling some of his anger begin to fade. He could see that Patricia was genuinely distressed by what had happened, but he also knew that sorry wasn't enough. Patricia, I need you to understand that this morning could have gone very differently. If I had been someone else, someone without my training and experience, this situation could have escalated into something much worse. Your assumptions and actions put everyone at risk. Officer Thompson nodded in agreement. Chief Williams is right. False reports like this can lead to serious consequences. What you did this morning is exactly the kind of incident that damages trust between the police and the community, David continued. Every time someone calls us based on assumptions rather than actual criminal behavior, it makes our job harder and makes people less likely to trust us when they really need help. Patricia was crying openly now, seemingly overwhelmed by the magnitude of her mistake. I never meant for any of this to happen. I thought I was protecting the neighborhood. From what? David asked. From me? From my family? From the idea that people who look like us might actually belong in a neighborhood like this? Patricia couldn't answer, which was an answer in itself. David looked around at his neighbors, many of whom were still watching from their yards. He knew that word of this incident would spread quickly through Pine Valley Estates, and he wasn't sure whether that was a good thing or a bad thing. Here's what's going to happen, David said, turning back to Patricia. You're going to go home and think very carefully about what occurred here today. You're going to consider why you made the assumptions you made, and you're going to work on changing that kind of thinking. Patricia nodded eagerly, clearly hoping this was the end of her consequences. But that's not all, David continued. You mentioned that you run the Neighborhood Watch program. That means you have influence over how people in this community think about safety and security. I want you to use that influence responsibly. What do you mean? Patricia asked. I mean that Neighborhood Watch programs should be about actual suspicious behavior, not about deciding who does and doesn't belong based on appearance. I want you to educate the other members about the difference. Officer Chen stepped forward. Chief, would you like us to provide some training materials for the Neighborhood Watch program? That's an excellent idea, David replied. Patricia, you'll be working with Officer Chen to organize a proper training session for your group. You'll learn about what actually constitutes suspicious behavior versus what's just different from what you're used to seeing. Patricia nodded again, though she looked overwhelmed by the prospect of having to explain this incident to the other Neighborhood Watch members. And Patricia, David added, I want you to understand that my family and I are not going anywhere. This is our home. We belong here just as much as anyone else, and we deserve to be treated with the same respect and consideration you'd show any other neighbor. I understand, Patricia said quietly, and I really am sorry. To you and to your family. David studied her face, trying to determine whether her apology was genuine or just a reaction to being caught in an embarrassing mistake. Time would tell. The officers began preparing to leave, and the crowd of neighbors started to disperse. David realized that his peaceful Saturday morning was completely ruined, but perhaps something positive could come from this awful experience. As Patricia walked back toward her house, she paused and turned around. Chief Williams, will you be able to forgive me for this? David considered the question carefully. Forgiveness was important, but so was accountability. Patricia, Forgiveness isn't something that happens immediately after an apology. It's something that's earned through changed behavior over time. Ask me again in 6 months after you've shown that you've actually learned from this experience. Patricia nodded one final time and continued toward her house, leaving David alone with his officers. "Chief," Officer Rodriguez said, "is there anything else you need from us?" David looked around his backyard, at the pool that had been the center of so much conflict, at the coffee that had long since gone cold, at the peaceful morning that had turned into a painful lesson about prejudice and assumptions. "Just make sure this gets documented properly," David said, "and let's use it as a training opportunity for the whole department. If this can happen to me in my own backyard, then we need to make sure we're prepared to handle these situations with sensitivity when they involve other members of the community." As the officers left and the neighborhood returned to its normal quiet, David finally had his backyard to himself again. But the peace of the morning was gone, replaced by the sobering reminder that even success, achievement, and authority couldn't always protect someone from being judged by the color of their skin. He looked at his pool one more time, then gathered his things and went inside to tell Michelle what had happened. The conversation with Patricia was over, but the larger conversation about assumptions, prejudice, and belonging in America was far from finished.